There is one number quietly shaping your decisions every day. It is not your salary, and it is not your bank balance. But it influences how you think about risk, time horizon, and even small spending choices. This number defines when you stop feeling constant financial pressure. Not when you quit your job, but when uncertainty feels manageable. It changes how you react to volatility and unexpected expenses. The problem is most people never calculate this number, so they keep extending their timeline without realizing it. And over time, the feeling of being behind slowly compounds. Strangely, higher income does not always bring you closer to it. In many cases, it increases lifestyle volatility and raises the baseline, which quietly pushes the number further away. At the margin, we do not rely on motivation or shortcuts. We break down the math behind decisions and long-term outcomes. And today, we calculate the number that quietly shapes your life. Let's start with something simple. How much does your life actually cost each year? Not a guess, but a real number you've seen over time. Say you need $40,000 a year. That covers a normal life without constant stress. Nothing extravagant, just stable and predictable. Now multiply that number by 25. This isn't random. It reflects long-term market behavior and compounding patterns. It's tied to risk, time horizon, and historical drawdowns. 40,000 times 25 equals 1 million. That becomes your freedom number over a long-term horizon. It's not magic, it's just math interacting with volatility. If your lifestyle costs 60,000 instead, the number becomes 1.5 million. The math scales faster than most people expect. Small increases quietly expand the target. The more expensive your life becomes, the further that number moves. It doesn't feel obvious in the moment, but over time the distance grows quietly. This is rarely taught in school or work. A higher salary doesn't always reduce financial risk. Sometimes it increases exposure to volatility and long-term pressure. Because the real problem isn't income. It's how much your life requires to sustain. That number decides how free you actually are. Imagine two people with very different incomes. One earns $80,000 a year, the other earns $200,000. On paper, the gap looks like a completely different life trajectory. But income alone does not define direction. The first lives on $40,000, the second spends almost everything. Their financial reality moves in opposite directions over time. One saves half consistently over a long-term horizon. The other saves almost nothing despite higher income. The difference compounds quietly beneath the surface. From the outside, the higher income looks like success. But internally, it carries higher risk and less flexibility. The pressure builds with every fixed expense. The lower spender has time on their side. The higher spender carries obligations that reduce options. Time horizon becomes the real advantage. A smaller lifestyle lowers the freedom number significantly. That reduces exposure to volatility and short-term shocks. Progress becomes faster even if it looks slower. This is the modern paradox of income and lifestyle. The more you upgrade, the more expensive your freedom becomes. Each upgrade increases your long-term requirement. So the outcome is not driven by income alone. It is driven by how much you actually need over time. The one who needs less reaches freedom first. Now we talk about time, because numbers without time mean nothing in real life. And this is where most people quietly fall behind. Saving 10% of your income sounds responsible. It feels like you're doing the right thing long term. But the time horizon tells a different story. At a 10% saving rate, the math stretches far. You're looking at roughly 50 years of compounding. That is an entire working lifetime. Increase it to 20% and things improve. The timeline compresses, but not dramatically. You're still playing a very long game. At 50%, the dynamic shifts. Compounding starts working with you, not against you. The timeline drops to around 17 years. Above 70%, the timeline compresses aggressively. You're now looking at 7 to 10 years. Not retirement, but an exit from pressure. Most people are never told this clearly, because slower timelines keep the system stable. Fast exits are not the default path. The less you need, the faster you move. Lower dependency reduces risk and shortens your timeline. Freedom is often a function of simplicity. There is one more factor people ignore. It makes the number feel unrealistic at the beginning, especially when your time horizon is still long. The first 100,000 is the hardest part, not because of volatility, but because of effort. Most of the capital comes directly from you. At this stage, compounding is barely visible. Growth feels slow and almost disappointing. The drawdown risk feels more real than the upside. Then something shifts over time. The numbers start moving without your constant input. Compounding begins to show quietly. At $1 million, the math looks different. The portfolio can generate around 70,000 annually. Not from effort, but from time and compounding. This is where the relationship reverses. Your money works harder than you do, and volatility matters less over a long-term horizon. Most people never reach this phase. They stop during the slow part, because the results do not feel meaningful yet. Compounding is not slow. It simply needs time to become visible. Most people leave before it starts working. Here is the uncomfortable reality most people avoid. The majority never reach their freedom number over a long-term time horizon, not because of ability, but because of hidden behavioral patterns. Income increases over time, which seems like progress, but lifestyle adjusts almost immediately with no pause. The gap that should build never gets the chance to grow. A higher salary often leads to a more expensive apartment, then a better car follows shortly after. Each upgrade feels reasonable in isolation. Meanwhile, the freedom number quietly moves higher, faster than your compounding progress can keep up, and the shift often goes unnoticed. This pattern has a name: lifestyle inflation. It is not driven by volatility or market risk. It is driven by everyday decisions repeated over time. It creates the illusion of forward movement, but your financial position stays within the same range, like upgrading the walls of a cage. The more comfortable it becomes, the harder it is to question it. Time passes without urgency, and leaving no longer feels necessary. The issue is not that you do not earn enough. It is that your required baseline keeps expanding, and that changes the entire long-term equation. There is another concept that rarely gets attention. It is called coasting, and most people miss it completely. But once you see it, the entire path looks different. This is the point where your investments become self-sustaining. They continue to grow without additional input from you. Compounding quietly takes over the heavy lifting. It means you do not have to keep pushing at the same intensity. You can slow down without breaking your long-term trajectory. The pressure starts to shift in a subtle way. Here is a simple example to ground this idea. $300,000 at age 30. With a long enough time horizon, it can become something much larger. No additional contributions are required in this scenario. Time and compounding handle the growth quietly. Volatility may exist, but the long-term trend does the work. At this point, the pressure of life starts to change. It does not disappear, but it becomes lighter. The emotional drawdown is less intense. You are no longer working purely out of necessity. You begin to operate from a place of choice. And that shift changes how you see risk entirely. Freedom is not a final destination. It is the moment you gain real flexibility in your decisions. It is when your time starts to belong to you again. There is one final trap. It is subtle and rarely discussed. Most people don't even realize it's happening. As you get closer to your number, something shifts. The target quietly starts moving. Not drastically, just enough to feel uncertain. 1 million feels insufficient. 1.2 feels safer. 1.5 begins to feel acceptable. This is not a math problem. It is driven by psychology. And psychology compounds quietly over time. You are no longer chasing freedom. You are chasing a sense of safety. And that feeling has no clear finish line. This is often called one more year. Just one more cycle of work and saving. Then somehow it repeats again. Without noticing, time gets exchanged. Years are traded for slightly higher numbers. The trade feels small but accumulates. The freedom number is not just mathematics. The real question is when you decide it is enough. and that decision defines your time horizon. Now you understand there's a number quietly shaping your life. It defines your risk, your time horizon, and how much pressure you carry daily. And the strange part is, it has always been visible, just rarely calculated. You can calculate it today using real numbers, not comfortable guesses. It requires honesty about spending, volatility, and long-term expectations. Most people avoid this step because clarity removes illusion. Freedom is not about being rich or chasing extreme outcomes. It is about reducing dependency and gaining control over your time. Compounding works quietly in the background while your choices become more flexible. Most people never run the numbers in detail. They rely on hope instead of understanding risk and drawdown. And over time, that gap quietly compounds in the wrong direction. If you want to keep understanding numbers like this, stay close to this channel. We focus on long-term thinking, realistic assumptions, and clear breakdowns. No hype, just the math behind how life actually works.